We're going to go in the order they kick off. So, I mean, that means we get Notre Dame, Indiana right away. 8 o'clock next Friday night, ABC. First time a Notre Dame game, home game, has been televised by somebody other than NBC in over 30 years. Notre Dame's a 7.5-point favorite against the Hoosiers from down in the southern part of Indiana. What do you think, Bryan?
Well, my first thought on this one, Vince. Sorry, Sean. My first thought on this one, Sean, is I kind of said, Trevor, what was it, about 2 weeks ago, that don't be shocked if they end up putting Notre Dame and Indiana in the playoffs together because of money. Right? Meaning you don't have to spend as much to hop a bunch of players on a bus to drive them 2 hours from Bloomington as you would have to fly.
I do wonder how much that played into the seeding.
I think it did. I think it did a little bit. And coming from a Division III program, that's a lot of what they did. The seedings would be, okay, who's close by? Mm-hmm. It's like, these two OAC teams were always ranked really high, but then they'd always have to play each other in the first round because they're close to each other. But, look, I think this is a very intriguing matchup. This is probably, I think, the second most anticipated game of the first round behind Ohio State and Tennessee. Just looking at it from a national standpoint, not from a Notre Dame standpoint. But I think this is a very intriguing matchup between two teams that on one side of the ball are very similar. And on the other side of the ball could not be more different. And I think that's going to make for an interesting matchup. There's so many storylines, and both of these teams are kind of playing in this moment for the first time, this playoff game type environment. Notre Dame hasn't been in the playoff under this head football coach. The Alabama or the Indiana head coach has been in this situation before as an assistant at Alabama, but not as a head football coach at this level. But he's also played for a national championship at the FCS level. There's so many different storylines that you can go into, but at the end of the day, this is one of those programs that you have a traditional blue blood against a team that has no football history whatsoever, and they're going to meet and with identical records in what is going to be, I think, arguably the most entertaining of the first round games. Is kind of my first look at what I think about this matchup, guys. But I also think that Notre Dame's the better team, and I think the line of this game is where it should be.
I don't disagree with that. I don't disagree with that at all. What do you think, Trevor?
Yeah, I'm with that. I mean, it's a great storyline, right? Especially for people that have lived in Indiana and have been around both programs and are familiar with both programs. I grew up around South Bend, but I mean, for anybody that lives up north, you get it. There's no shortage of IU fans there because at the end of the day, we live in the state of Indiana. Of course, there's going to be IU fans everywhere, right? But I think it's a cool storyline. Maybe not for people that live in California. They might not care about the battle for Indiana, but it's really cool.
A lot of Indy fans out there, baby.
There are a lot of Notre Dame fans out there, as the USC Trojans found out on November 30th. But I think it's going to be a fun matchup. I see it playing out very similar to how Bryan talked about. I think it's going to be, what kind of gives way first. IU is going to come out fired up for this, as they should be. Not saying that Notre Dame won't, but I do believe that the team, their fans, like, they kind of know that they're playing with house money a little bit. Like, they get it. They weren't even supposed to be here. Like, they weren't projected to do what they were supposed to do this year, and they did it in emphatic fashion. They went 11-1. Only loss was to Ohio State, which makes this, I think, a lot more interesting. Not, it's not like a Clemson situation where they backdoored themselves into the playoffs and kind of snuck in and nobody thinks they should be here. IU put themselves before the Ohio State game at the number 5 team in the country. They went into that game 10-0. They won 10 straight. We've been really high on Notre Dame for winning 10 straight games, and so IU did that to start their season. So all of those storylines combined, you have on the other side, you have Notre Dame overcoming that really bad loss on September 7th and ripping off 10 straight games themselves to finish out the season. So you have two pretty hot college football teams coming into this matchup. And above all else, I think that it's fitting that the first ever college football playoff game played at a campus in NCAA history in football is at Notre Dame Stadium. Yep. I couldn't imagine it being anywhere else.
Sean, I know we're going to get to the how they got here conversation here in a minute, but Trevor, the thing that you had mentioned about Indiana that makes this an intriguing matchup is the point you made is they know they're playing with house money. There's zero pressure on Indiana going into this game. Zero. They're an over touchdown underdog. Nobody thinks they should have been here to begin with. They're a bunch of group of 5 players that transferred up to the Power 4 level for their final seasons. There's zero pressure on them. All the pressure right now is on Notre Dame. I mean, Notre Dame can't afford. If Indiana loses this game by a field goal, it's a moral victory for the program. I mean, it is. I don't know that Curt Cignetti will look at it that way because of how competitive he is, but big picture, it is. If Notre Dame loses by a field goal, it's
everybody else is going to feel good about it, with the exception
right.
of him and the team.
Right.
Like everyone in IU Nation is going to feel good about it because it is a basketball school. And I mean, it's literally football has been even less than an afterthought forever at Indiana. You know,
Notre Dame doesn't view us important enough to schedule.
Sure.
We went to their place, played them down to the wire. That's a win. Notre Dame wins by a field goal. It's like, that's a disappointing win is what a lot of people think. And if Notre Dame loses by a field goal, it's devastating. It's crushing. It's wow. How could you lose to that football team? Mm-hmm. So all the pressure is on the team from South Bend. I mean, that's where it is. So when you look at these type of games, those things matter. Who's feeling the burden of that moment? How does Indiana handle it? That's going to be the big question. But also, how does Notre Dame handle it? I actually think Notre Dame has handled those type of moments pretty well this season under Marcus Freeman. And you look at how they performed going into the A&M game when there was a lot of pressure on them. USC game, they're playing for a playoff spot. The Army game and all that meant. But this is a different animal now.
Well, and that's the different animal. I'm glad you said that because that's what's been going through my head here for a minute because, Cignetti does have the experience, lost some championship games in, at the FCS level, but played in those games. He's gone through FCS playoffs, but the exposure now and the attention on this game, especially because they are playing at Notre Dame Stadium, is going to be unlike anything he's ever faced, because let's face it, at the FCS level, it's generally your fan base that really cares, like those games don't even, some of those other games show up on TV, but in terms of like national, like anyone really watching and paying attention, it's not until the very end of the process. But every step of the way, every decision that you make now, and you can say this, really with the exception of the Ohio State game, he's never even had to go through that this year. So, my initial thought was, does Cignetti have an advantage because he's been through these playoff kind of situations? But then again, the other side of it is what I just kind of went through. It's a completely different thing now being at this level and this kind of playoff and this stage than even what he's been through before at James Madison.
The other thing, too, guys, at James Madison, his teams were really talented.
Yeah.
I mean, they were one of the 2 or 3 best rosters in college football. They were Notre Dame. They were Notre Dame in a lot of those matchups when he was at James Madison. So, like, when you look at the year that they went to the national championship game and lost to North Dakota State by 8 points, that was a great North Dakota State team. The only other team they lost to that year was a 7-point loss to West Virginia. And keep in mind, they were an FCS team. They beat ranked Elon. They beat ranked Stony Brook. They beat ranked Villanova. They beat ranked Towson. They beat ranked New Hampshire. They beat ranked Monmouth. They beat ranked Northern Iowa. They beat ranked Weber State. But that's partly because they were always the most talented team on the field. And it's a little bit different for him now.
Yeah.
And that's going to be part of it too, Sean. But like you said, this is a head coach that understands how to prepare a team for a playoff. And it's a different animal when you've got 3-4 games to play than it is when you've got 1 or 2. And I do think that gives him an advantage. Plus, he's also been someone who has coached at this level. I mean, he was an assistant coach and the recruiting coordinator on the Alabama team that won the first title under Saban. So it's not like he's an FCS lifer that's just learning how to be on the stage. This is a guy that has coached. He understands the pressure of playing in this type of moment. He coached in an SEC title game, multiples actually. He's coached on a national championship game. There's a lot less pressure on an assistant coach. 100%, but he understands what the head coach had to do. He was there. Sure. You know what I mean? So you know what the moment's like for your players. You know the pressures of getting them ready for that type of moment. And I don't think this game is going to be like that game was, because this is still a first-round game, not a national title game. But I think those things help him. But at the end of the day, Notre Dame's kind of been through some of this stuff as well, right? I mean, getting ready for the Texas A&M game and all the questions they had to answer, getting ready to play Ohio State last year. Can Marcus Freeman get his guys ready to play in this moment? And the unique thing too, guys, is Notre Dame has been in a playoff mindset since September 6th or September 7th. I mean, they've had to be. They were in a we can't lose again mode since the first week of September when they lost to Northern Illinois. And so how does that help them going into this type of environment? You know, that's kind of what we're going to find out.
Yeah. I mean, for the reasons that you just listed out, that's what makes Indiana such a dangerous team, is because they're not hanging their hats on any moral victories. I mean, shoot, Notre Dame had a head coach not too long ago that hung his hat on moral victories. I'm serious. You know what I mean? Like, I mean, Kurt Signetti could
we all know what you mean.
Oh, yeah. Kurt Signetti could easily go into this game and be like, yo, we weren't even supposed to be here, guys. Let's give Notre Dame a run for their money. Like, this is a coach that's competitive enough that if he doesn't win this game, he will believe that the better team didn't win that game. And that's a dangerous
100%.
coach in the playoff, man. That is a dangerous coach in the playoff. And that's
absolutely thinks his team is better than Notre Dame.
Yeah. And he should. Like, it's like not from matchups. You should believe that your team has the best.
As the head coach, he should feel like that.
Well,
yeah.
I kind of, I don't know. Sometimes I feel like you should have a realistic understanding of who you are, because that should dictate how you prepare your team, not how you prepare your game plan, right? Like if I think I'm not as good as you, I know sometimes I'm going to have to take some chances that I can't otherwise take, right? If I know I'm definitely better than you, I may not go for it on 4th down at midfield, because I know you can't move the ball on us and we're the better team. And so I'm going to punt here. So I do think in that regard, maybe, but at the same time, I don't think he looks at it. I think sometimes guys that are as arrogant as Kurt Signetti is, and I mean that in a complimentary fashion, because if he wasn't as arrogant as he was, they would not be.
They wouldn't be where they are.
Right.
Yeah.
100%. And they won't have a chance to beat Notre Dame. If he prepares his team like, hey guys, they're just better than us. And we're not supposed to be here. And they're going to get rolled, and so he needs to have that mindset. But, I get the point you're making, Trevor. I do. I think he genuinely believes that. There's no doubt in my mind, and he's going to prepare his team and call that game.
Look,
and do it as aggressively as he has done every other game.
I mean, he believed it since, what was that, July, when he stepped to the podium and, the Google me comment, I win everywhere I go. And we all kind of laughed and chuckled. It's like, okay, Kurt Signetti, you're still the head coach at Indiana. Let's kind of control yourself here a little bit. But, look, he's shocked us all. But it starts with the confidence that he has both in himself and his guys. And, look, like you said, he had better athletes than pretty much everyone else when he was at James Madison, and he brought the best ones who wanted to come with him to Indiana. It gave them a chance to play on a bigger stage. And now here they are on the biggest stage in college football coming up next week.
Which is why I loved Marcus Freeman's comment of, well, I Googled him.
And he has one everywhere he's been.
Yeah.
I thought that was great.
Oh, it was awesome.
I still think it's like like the fact that he kept a straight face during that whole thing. It was not like, I'm throwing shade. He was just I Googled him. He's won everywhere he's been.
Because
no hint of sarcasm to it.
In typical Marcus Freeman fashion, he then continued to break down the team. It's like, so I went and I Googled him, and they are a really good football team. They're still athletes. And it was perfect. It was awesome.
So when you look at this matchup, any particulars that you guys, want to talk about that you're looking at Notre Dame, Indiana?
Well, I think when you look at this Indiana football team, here's the thing. When you look at kind of where they came from, these two teams are coming from a very similar place. And that also adds into the intrigue of this matchup, in that these teams have not played a lot of close football games this season. And coming into the year, I think Indiana was favored, 16th or 17th in the Big Ten, right? Coming into the season. And not much is expected. Beat Florida International in the opener, who cares? Beat Western Illinois in this NCAA game, who cares? When they beat UCLA by 29 on the road, you started to be like, well, that's interesting. I didn't see that coming. I mean, I don't think UCLA is that good, but boy, they just blew UCLA out on the road. And then they just kept winning and winning and winning. And then you're like, hey, this Nebraska game, this is going to tell us who they really are, because this Nebraska team's, really good. They're 4-1, 5-1, coming into that game. And, everybody's talking about this team is, this could be the upstart. Like, Nebraska is the team that everybody predicted could be Indiana, right? That was a team like, hey, they may be 7-0. going into this game against Ohio State, or 6-1 at worst going in this game against Ohio State. And Indiana was like, no, that's going to be us. And that game where they beat Nebraska 56-7, that kind of, I think, woke everybody up to like, hold on a second, this is something different. And then they lose their quarterback in that game, and they beat Washington by 14 the next week. And then it really wasn't, guys, until they played Michigan on November 9th that they played a competitive football game.
Right.
A genuinely competitive football. There's a couple games that were close in the second half, and they pulled away late. Like I think it was the Northwestern game was that way.
Maryland was that
way, but they were in control of that game. They really didn't play a competitive game until that November game, and it's kind of a lot like Notre Dame, where Notre Dame went a long period of time, really from the start of the bye week until the USC game, where they didn't play a competitive football game. I mean, not even like the Louisville game was competitive, even though I don't think Sean, we were up there sitting beside each other for that game. It was never like they're going to lose this game. It was always kind of like, what's the margin going to be?
Right. And I felt like if wherever it was, if Notre Dame gets one more touchdown, this game is over. And they kind of flirted, and it took them a little bit longer to get there.
Right.
But they finally did. Yeah,
right.
You're absolutely right.
And it wasn't until USC, and even in that game, they had a 21-point lead with like a couple minutes left, and then USC went down and scored. Sean's got a cramp. It's not really until that moment that you've kind of looked at it and said, hey, I think this football team has a chance to be really good for Indiana. And Trev, when you look at Notre Dame and how they got here, it's a very similar path post Northern Illinois.
Yeah.
Didn't play a great schedule, not a lot of great teams on there, but they dominated all of those teams. And that's the mark of a good football team. Everybody's like, well, you can't be good if you don't have a good strength of schedule. Well, that's nonsense. You can be good if you play a bad schedule, but you better dominate that schedule. That's exactly what Indiana did. And that's exactly what Notre Dame did to get here.
Yeah, absolutely. And then when you go and you dive into what Notre Dame's path was, I'm not going to go too in depth about it because everybody in this chat, us included, we know how it was. You start out great against Texas A&M. Tragedy hits a week later in your home opener. But the fact that Notre Dame was able to rip off 10 straight games, and it's not like games that we had seen in the past, right? It's not like the Duke game from last year where it was really ugly and Notre Dame kind of snuck out a win at the end. Their average margin of victory in those 10 games was 30.7 points, and they scored an average of 44.1 in that 10-game winning streak. So not only in just a short time to come back and rebound from losing to Northern Illinois at home, not only did they come out and beat teams like they should have to go on a 10-game win streak, they were dominating opponents, very similar to what Indiana was doing to start their first, really 9 games of the season until they played against Michigan, right? So you go and you look at that path, and we brought it up earlier. Notre Dame has been playing playoff elimination games since September 8th. You know what I mean? They were on September 14th against Purdue. You lose that game, you're out of the playoffs, no matter what. They could have ripped off 9 straight and looked awesome doing it. You're not getting into the playoffs after dropping back-to-back, right? So because then you're having a conversation of Notre Dame is having to battle back within the top 12, not just from 18th, but most likely from unranked, especially if Purdue's season played out the rest of the way that it did. You know what I'm saying? And Notre Dame's 2 losses is to a MAC school and a team that finished 2-10. So what they were able to do almost immediately afterwards has prepared this team and built them up to where, yes, it's Marcus Freeman's first playoff, but you could make the argument this is his 11th elimination game from the college football playoff. So for those reasons, I think to what you said about Indiana's path to get here and Notre Dame's path to get here, that's what makes this matchup so fun. Yeah. And that's what makes it so intriguing.
There's no doubt. That's when you look at sort of this matchup, Trevor, you start to dive into it and look, we're going to take a deep dive into this particular matchup in this coming week at Irish Breakdown. But just looking at some of the things that are going to factor into this game, look, Indiana, it's strength on strength when you look at the Notre Dame offense against the Indiana defense. And when you win these types of games, it's like, okay, yeah, they know what we want to do. We know what they want to do, but who's going to be better at? Who's going to be better at executing their strength? Is it going to be Indiana's run defense plays better than Notre Dame's rush offense, or is Notre Dame's rush offense going to play better than Indiana's rush defense? That's key number one. And then the second key is whose complementary part of their game is going to play better. So when you look at we'll start with the Notre Dame offense against the Indiana defense, because I think the same story is true on the other side of the ball. Indiana's pass game is dynamic and elite, and Notre Dame's pass secondary and pass defense is outstanding. It's one of the best. Their run defense is good, not great. Indiana's run game is good, not great. So on both sides of the ball, you have these matchups of, like, in Indiana, I know ranks high in pass defense, but I think a lot of that has to do with they played a lot of really bad passing offenses this year, right? And they have a good secondary. That's not meant to take away anything from Indiana. They're a good football team. You were praising the Pons kid yesterday in our show, and he's outstanding. Their two safeties are a really good player.
Yes.
Osprey's a really good player. Farrell's a very good player. This is a good secondary. But when I look at it, this is where it is. It's strength on strength and then good on good. There's no area where either team is weak, but Notre Dame's strength is running the football. Indiana's strength is on defense is stopping the run. Which one of those carries the day? But also, who plays better in that other area? Can Notre Dame do enough throwing the football to take the pressure off their run game and make Indiana play straight up? Or does the pass game struggle allow Indiana to commit more resources to the run game, which could make life a little bit tougher on Notre Dame? That's really what it's going to be, is those – for Notre Dame, you're the best part of who you are has to roll, and then the other part is your complementary piece has to be – it's got to be at least good, especially early in the game. And for Notre Dame, that's going to be the key. And for Indiana, the key is, can you shut down the Notre Dame run game? Notre Dame is much more beatable when you can stop them from running the football. Louisville really committed a lot of resources to stopping the run, and the result was Notre Dame jumped all over them early by throwing the ball over their head. And then every time Notre Dame needed a score, that's exactly what they went back to, attack their aggressiveness, right? So Notre Dame throws the ball, they get the ball down the field, throw over the top for a touchdown to Jaden Greathouse, build a 21-7 lead. Louisville starts coming back, and what do? Next drive, throw a deep ball to Jaden Harrison for a big play, and then run a bootleg, a sprint out screen to Jeremiah Love to take advantage of that for a big play. And they were able to kind of take advantage of that. So, yes, it kept Notre Dame from running the ball for great yards, but it's the reason why they were able to hit some big plays, because of how aggressive Louisville was to play that. Will Indiana be able to do that, or can they beat Notre Dame straight up? I mean, when you watch them play defense, they're bringing guys into the box from all over. Their nickel comes flying down, their safeties come flying down. They'll bring corner fires. They're going to get guys into the box from a lot of different ways, and it creates a lot of issues for offenses. Can Notre Dame find answers for that? That's going to be a big key to this game. Very big. Key.
There's going to be a lot of tendencies that IU does that we're going to break down next week, so I don't want to insert that into this conversation right now. To me, the matchup in the battle that I'm going to be paying the most attention to is going to be the battle on offense and defense inside of the 20-yard line. The red zone is going to be – and on both sides, but it's two different narratives, right? You look at Notre Dame's defense versus IU's offense. IU's offense has the number 3 ranked red zone offense in the country. And I believe they've had 66 trips to the red zone. They've scored touchdowns on 62 of them. I think they're somewhere around like 93% scoring in the red zone as an offense. Then you look at Notre Dame's defense. They don't give up a whole lot. I think it's either 15 or 17 touchdowns in the red zone. And they have the number 9 overall red zone defense in the country. So if Indiana is able to get the ball inside of the 20, who wins that matchup? But then you look at it on the other side of the field, right? You look at Notre Dame's offense versus IU's red zone defense. Notre Dame's red zone offense right now is 74th in the country. And we've talked a lot before about, field goal kicking is playing a factor in that. They do rank higher than 74th when we're just talking about touchdowns. But then you go through and you look at what Indiana has done. And Indiana on red zone
10th in touchdowns.
Yep.
Notre Dame ranks 10th in touchdowns.
But IU's red zone defense is 65th in the country, and they allow scores 82% of the time. So that matchup in between the 20s is going to be a huge indicator. Like, that is the way that I'm looking at it for this game. That's the hollowed ground. Like, that is that's the war zone that either team has to hypothetically plant their flag on and say, hey, one of the reasons why we won today is because we beat the opponent in the red zone.
Right.
So that, to me, on top of everything that you had just listed out, is going to be massive.
Right. When you look at the matchup too, Trevor, Indiana's an interesting team because they have the numbers of a team that you'd expect to be super dominant in the trenches. And they're very good in the trenches, but they're not a typical trench team where they're not like Georgia. They're not super big and long and first-round NFL draft picks. I mean, they play a lot of line games. And if you're Notre Dame, this is a matchup concern for you. I'm watching the Michigan game, and I'm watching Mikhail Kamara slant around and just blow up the run game. They do a lot of that stuff. Those are things that have given Notre Dame a lot of problems this year. So that's the thing that concerns me a little bit too about this matchup from a Notre Dame standpoint is they do things defensively that Notre Dame has had some problems with, but haven't really faced anybody good enough to give them some of those problems. And how they're able to find answers for that. You know, can they find ways to take advantage of that? And that's what good offenses do. When you look at it from the Indiana standpoint, you know, their offense is when their quarterback gets time to throw the football, they're lights out. I mean, they are absolutely lights out. When you look at their quarterback, Curtis Rourke, and the job he has done this season, you know, he's a big reason why they have the number one red zone offense in the country. He just doesn't make mistakes. He doesn't beat himself. He's thrown 27 touchdowns this season, 4 interceptions. They don't throw for a ton of yards passing. They're a super efficient passing team. That's the thing about them. He's completed 74.4% of his passes. He's 9.9 yards per pass attempt, which is really outstanding. And then Taven Jackson this season, when he had to come off the bench and start, only went 6.5 yards per attempt, but he's been better than that when he's come off the bench in some games. But when you look at Curtis Rourke, there's a reason why his number is so much better than Taven Jackson's, because he's a smart, veteran, accurate quarterback that knows where to get the football. And the few times that teams have been able to give him problems this season is when they're able to get pressure on the quarterback.
Yes.
So if you're looking at it from an Indiana standpoint, they have got to find ways to protect the quarterback. If they can protect the quarterback, they're pretty good. The issue that they had against Ohio State, it's not that their receivers were just dominated by Ohio State's DBs, and to a degree there was that. Ohio State's secondary did not allow a lot of free runners. Michigan did allow a lot of free runners early in that game. You know, they bought on double moves, getting beat over the middle on deep end cuts, things like that. But when you look at the Ohio State game, it wasn't so much that the receivers weren't able to get separation. You didn't know if they were able to get separation because the ball was, I mean, the quarterback was getting hit so quickly,
right,
that you just didn't know if they were going to be able to protect the quarterback in that game. And that's the thing, is if they can protect their quarterback, then they'll have some chances to be successful in this game. Protecting the quarterback isn't just about pass pro. It's also about scheme, getting the ball out quickly, running screen game, taking advantage of Notre Dame being an aggressive blitz team. Indiana runs a lot of screens, a lot of very effective screens where if they think they can catch you in a blitz, they're going to slip screen you right behind it and try to gash you for a big play. Those are things that you look at, Trevor, and say these are aspects of this matchup that you look at and say which team can again find answers to that part of the matchup. That's a big key in this game. Is Notre Dame's got to be able to pressure the quarterback without being vulnerable to the blitz beaters. Indiana's got to find a way to protect the quarterback. Which one of those two things wins the day?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've been saying it all week. There's a direct correlation between the pressures that IU has given up and when Curtis Rourke turns the football over. He threw 2 interceptions against Maryland. He was sacked 3 times. He threw an interception against Michigan and fumbled, right? And their offense put up 20 points. And he was pressured like 11 total times, but it was, 3 sacks, 2 hits on the quarterback, 7 hurries. And then obviously you saw what, you saw what happened against Ohio State. Ohio State was able to rip off 5 sacks against Rourke, and he finished the game 8 of 18 for 68 yards, and they didn't cross the 50-yard line again until their second to last drive of the fourth quarter. So it's all going to be down to if Notre Dame is able to get pressure on the quarterback. It's going to come down to that.
So you talk about they didn't have a lot of pressures, and this is what's so I'm just going to be honest with you. The issues I have with Pro Football Focus is they don't have, like against Michigan, they only had Indiana giving up 14 total pressures, which isn't a lot. It's a higher number, but it's not a ton. But 7 of those resulted in hits on the quarterback. And early on, Michigan wasn't getting to the quarterback. I mean, that double move that they hit, Mason Graham came through late, but Rourke was able to get the ball off and then hit Elijah Sherratt for the touchdown. After that, Michigan started getting home a lot more on the quarterback, and that's when Indiana's offense just shut down. And then in Ohio State, first drive, Indiana's getting the ball out, they're hitting screens, they're running the football, they're doing all those other type of things. And then boom, pressure starts getting to the quarterback and they're shut down. That's really what it comes down to. Not a lot of teams were able to do that against them, Trevor, at least not for an entire game. Can Notre Dame do that? We'll see.
We'll see. Be a big question. Going to be a huge question in terms of the matchup, and I know we're going to dive in more about it next week for sure. So, predictions, Bryan. What do you have for this game? Because I'm going to be interested to see what you say.
So, my prediction for this game is I think it's going to be a tight game early. I think it's going to be 14-13, 17-14, 13-10, something like that at halftime. Not sure who's going to have the lead. I think it's going to be a pretty good game early. I think these teams are going to fill each other out. I think Notre Dame's their defense is going to give up a couple plays early. I think whether it's a screen or a double move, I think there's some things they do that against Notre Dame's man defense that make them a little bit vulnerable to maybe some big plays. We've talked about that. And I think the offense is going to probably need a little bit of time to kind of get rolling. But I think coming out of the break, I think this Notre Dame offense starts to find its groove. I think they find some holes, and I think Notre Dame runs away with it early. So my prediction for right now is I do have Notre Dame winning this football game. I have them winning this football game 34-24, a game that's a lot closer in the first half, but I think the defense takes the game over in the second half, and the offense finds its groove, and Notre Dame pulls away from Indiana in the second half and wins by 10.
Yeah, I like that. I see it playing out a little bit similar. I think the defense is going to take over in the second half. For me, I have, and I'll kind of break down my score here in a second, but I see it going relatively similar to the Ohio State game. I don't think the final score is going to be as like Notre Dame's margin isn't going to be as much as Ohio State's. I don't think, but I have the final score being 34-16. I have it being somewhat closer. So I have it being a 14-10 game at halftime, and I think it's going to be very back and forth. But I do think after about the first quarter and a half, Notre Dame will have gotten Indiana's best. I think that's how it's going to play out. And then I think it's just going to be, somewhat of a field goal game in the second half for Indiana. I think they'll make it down to the red zone a couple times. Once they get to the fourth quarter, I think they're going to start going for it on fourth down a little bit more than just settling for field goals because of the margin of, what the score is at that point in time. So I think in the fourth quarter, they're held out of the end zone. I think Notre Dame's defense kind of settles in because they had seen everything that Indiana's offense is going to throw at them. And then for Notre Dame on offense, I just see it being a consistent game for them. I don't think that in the second half they really open it up and blow the doors off. Like I think they just kind of run their offense. So I have final score being 34-16. I just think that Notre Dame's defense is going to win the day in the second half and force 2 field goals in the third quarter for Indiana. Final score being 34-16.
Thank you for bearing with me. I had a cramp about the size of a softball in my left hamstring, and I was walking. I found a heating pad. Finally, I'm able to sit on the heating pad. I was trying to stand and hold it, and it kept recurring. So I went and got some sports drink, trying to get a little potassium, a little sodium in me, see what happens. Things are good right now, but I mean, you guys obviously nailed the most important points. I did want to make one thing that I looked at. There are 5 categories that tend to be good predictors of, are you going to be a national championship caliber team? And they are run offense, pass efficiency offense, run defense, total defense, and turnover margin. Both of these teams are pretty good in all of those categories. The only 2 where Notre Dame is not elite are pass efficiency offense and run defense. They're 38th in pass efficiency offense. They're 51st in run defense. Now, I think if you look at both of those, categories, like we pointed out on our show last week, the pass efficiency offense, they rank 38th, which is not horrible. It's not elite, but they're about 15 to 16, 17 spots higher since the Northern Illinois game. So they're still, from a pass efficiency standpoint, really good. Run defense, they're 51st, but they also had to play the 2 service academies. So, I mean, 500 yards combined in those 2 games,
Yeah.
because anyone is going to give up yards to those 2 teams, especially if you have to play both of them.
We broke this down. Was it Thursday, Trev?
Yeah, when we talked about
if you look at games against Power 5 teams only, Notre Dame ranks 20th in rush defense.
There you go.
So you not only take out Army Navy, but then you'd also take out Northern Illinois, which is one of their worst games of the season as well, in Miami of Ohio, which was a very good rushing performance statistically. So they kind of balance each other out. They rank 20th, right? And the reason I did it this year, I don't normally do it where I take out the one option team they play, Sean. But my point this year was you held Navy like 160 something below their season, or I mean like 60 something below their season average, and you held Army over 100 yards below their season average, and still gave up over 200 yards in each of those games. That's really skewing your overall data, right? And so those are things that we looked at. Now, they have had bad performances. Obviously, the USC game wasn't a very good performance. But again, it was another game where it was better than the 190 they gave up, because they had back-to-back 20-plus yard runs on the final drive when Notre Dame was basically going to go just let them go down the field and score, right? So they've been a little bit up and down, but when you do put the context of what have they done against Power 5 teams, Notre Dame's run defense looks a lot better.
And I would also say that there have been some games where, they were more focused on making sure they weren't giving up explosive pass plays, and they were willing to concede, some runs along the way. So, whatever you want to make of it, there's still a solid run defense. Like to your point, they're not horrible. And, again, like in most of the other departments, they are elite. I mean, they are tied for second in the nation in turnover margin, as an example. They're 9th in total defense. They're 10th in rush offense. So I think the match, and to Indiana's credit, they're pretty good in a lot of these categories as well. But I think that at the end of the day, like Trevor said, it plays out like Ohio State. I agree with that. Like to some extent, somewhat similar to Texas A&M. I don't think it maybe is as close as the Texas A&M game in the fourth quarter, but like Ohio State, the Ohio State-Indiana matchup, obviously. I think Indiana will have some success offensively early, because that's typically what happens against Notre Dame. But the question is, how are they going to respond once Al Golden and company knock them off script? Because I think that, they're not going to be able to just stay on a flat script the whole game. And that's where I do think, Notre Dame's not just going to run all over Indiana, but I think that as the game progresses, these are both really well-coached teams, but Notre Dame is the more talented, really well-coached team. And, again, like similar to Ohio State, Notre Dame and similar to Indiana's matchup with Ohio State and similar to Notre Dame's matchup with Texas A&M, Notre Dame has the ability to make more explosive plays on offense. And I think that will be a big factor as this game wears on. And I've got Notre Dame winning 27-17.
I think explosive plays will be a big part of it, Sean. Who makes them and who doesn't let them happen, right? I mean, we talked about that with the Notre Dame defense, Sean. It's big plays were one of our 3 keys that Trevor and I talked about, right? You got to make them, and you got to not let them have them. And I think that's big, because if Indiana is going to be in this game, it's not because they're methodically moving the ball up and down the field. It's because they're going to chunk play you to death, and that's going to be the way that they're going to beat you. So,
and that's what again, like this is an expanded playoff, but that has also been a huge factor once you get into like the when it's down to 4, obviously, but that's going to be a huge factor in all of these games. Which teams have the best chance to make the most explosive plays?
Right.
I think, because like you can talk about turnover margin and all those things. That's obviously going to be important all the time. But I think that Notre Dame has got the ability to make explosive plays on offense, and I think that they're better athletes, and they're better able to get to the perimeters better defensively to keep, Indiana from making a lot of those kind of plays.
I think that's what a lot of national people are missing about this Notre Dame defense, is how fast it is.
Right.
That's what I think people don't. So a lot of people that aren't, you hear a lot SEC fans, Indiana fans, well, Notre Dame's defense is overrated. Okay. All right. Like there was a guy that who I like. He's a smart football guy, but he broke down the Notre Dame IU game, and he's just ripping the Notre Dame defense apart. And I was like, I asked him, I said, "Is that the only game you watched? Was the Notre Dame USC game?" He's like, "Yeah." I was like, well, you didn't break down but he didn't break down the Ohio State Indiana game as the counter. He used a different game where Indiana played well. And it's like, well, if that's it's like I've said to Notre Dame fans,
break down the best team they played against.
You can't look at Indiana and say, well, they struggled against Ohio State, so they're going to struggle against Notre Dame because it was their worst game. And you also shouldn't look at USC and say, well, Notre Dame struggled there, so they're going to struggle against Indiana. You look at them at the entirety of their season, and that's why I think is the best way to do it. But even then, you still look at it and say, Indiana played a soft schedule. Notre Dame didn't play a very hard schedule, but Notre Dame certainly had a much tougher schedule than what Indiana faced, and Notre Dame was every bit as dominant, if not more so, than what Indiana was. And Trev, you and I have pointed that out. When you break down these games and you look at the statistics from these two games, and I think that's what a lot of people are missing. And it is funny to listen to some of the Indiana. Trev and I were talking about this yesterday, Sean. I was actually kind of thinking this is going to be a fun little build up to the game, and Indiana fans were just going to be excited to be here and all that kind of stuff. I have been really shocked.
It's
really
typical Indiana arrogance is what it is.
How much they're like, this team sucks. And like, I had a guy, I listened to, it was one of the most ridiculous things I've ever heard in my life. But this one Indiana podcast, they were talking about how Notre Dame struggled with Purdue.
I saw that. They were up 42-0 at halftime.
Exactly.
Where was the struggle? They took everybody out at halftime.
Exactly. And
half of their offensive line was out because of injuries.
They haven't played anyone as good as Michigan, and I'm like, what planet are you on? You know what I mean? It's like,
well, see, and that's Indiana keeps wanting to give Michigan credit for being the defending national champion, even though they're a 7-5 team this year. They're not that team. They're completely different. It's just, I give you credit. You're Indiana. You beat Michigan. That still means something if you're Indiana. Really, anyone across the Big Ten. Just ask Ryan Day, right? But you can't hang your hat on that just because you beat Michigan. I'm sorry.
Right. And the assumption that, Michigan is just better than this team or that team or the other thing. It is kind of interesting, but I look at it like this. When you look at Notre Dame and you look at what they've done this season, Indiana has a slightly bigger margin for a victory when you look at just their overall statistics. But a big chunk of that was because they beat an FCS team 77-13. You take that out of the way, and Notre Dame has a significantly better margin for victory. Notre Dame has a 26.2 margin of victory on the season, and Indiana is slightly less than that. So it's like if you use any kind of context whatsoever in this discussion, you're going to realize that Notre Dame has been a very dominant team. Indiana's been a very dominant team. And it's going to be a heck of a football game. That's the way I look at it. And I have a lot of respect for what Indiana's done. I'm not going to do what the Indiana fans are doing and say, Indiana sucks. They didn't beat anybody. Because the mark of a good team is you can't determine your schedule.
Exactly.
Right? But you can control what you do to that schedule. And one of the things I liked about this Indiana team is that they had that beat down against Ohio State, and they bounced back the next week and absolutely obliterated Purdue. Ran the score up a little bit, but it's still 28-0 at halftime. Right? And so I give them a lot of credit for that. I think Indiana is deserved a spot in the playoff. Trevor, I've been arguing this for a month. I said, look, even if they lose to Ohio State, I think they should be in as long as they continue to handle business, and they did. But I think this Notre Dame team is a different caliber team than what they've really faced. Because if we're being honest about it, and you can say whatever you want, this Notre Dame offense all season has been better than Ohio State's.
Yeah,
and I don't think, and Ohio State fans aren't going to like that, but that's
been much more consistent anyway.
Exactly,
yeah.
That's just a fact, especially in the last 2 months. Notre Dame has been a better offense. And so I believe Ohio State ranks higher in yards per game. But we've talked about this. Ohio State ranks 36th in yards per game. Notre Dame ranks 40th in yards per game. But when you look at it, their yards per play is almost identical. It's 6.8, 6.7. And Notre Dame has faced a tougher schedule, which is why Notre Dame's offense ranks where it does from an efficiency standpoint. So I just think it's certainly playing better going into the postseason. There's no doubt about that, because Ohio State's offense has not played all that well going into the postseason. They scored 38 points against Indiana. They had a punt return for a touchdown and a 7-yard touchdown drive that came off of another a ball that went over the punter's head, right? Or no, it went over his head, right? Am I remembering that correctly? Went over his head?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, but they still scored 24. But I don't think people understand how good this Notre Dame football team has been offensively the last two months. They're not scoring 45 points a game the last 2 months by accident.
Yeah. They're not squeaking out wins.
Right. And this isn't a shot at Ohio State, for the record. People know I'm very high on this Ohio State team in a lot of different ways. It's just to point out that there's this misconception about Notre Dame's offense based on what people saw against Northern Illinois. That team is long dead. This is a much different animal right now.